Hey guys, it's Quinlin. Welcome back to my channel. So I'm really happy I'm bringing you my May wrap-up today, and so I read a total of 10 books this month, which I'm really pleased with because other months I definitely read less, and so I'm really proud of my reading progress this month. So let's jump into it. The first book I read this month was Wicked King by Holly Black, and this is part of the Folk of the Air series. The first book is Cruel Prince, and if you want to know what it's about this girl Jude, and she has a twin sister and then an older sister who's half fairy. And so her older sister's dad, her biological dad who's a fairy, comes and kills the human parents of Jude and her twin. And so the fairy kills her parents and then kidnaps them and brings them to fairy. But now Jude is much older and she kind of wants to fit in, but obviously as a human they look down on her and they don't find her as powerful as any of the other fairy, and so they don't really appreciate her or want her to be part of their court, but she desperately wants to be. And so it's a story of just kind of like her struggle within fairy for kind of some semblance of power. And Wicked King is the second book in the series. So for this one, I kind of think this is my least favorite book in the series. I did enjoy it, but I felt like sometimes the plot was a little bit dragging on and I didn't really know where it was going. Like, I didn't feel like there was a direction in the book. And generally I like to feel like there's like a direction, like I have an objective, like, oh, we're gonna steal this, or we're gonna kill this person, or something like that. And yes, of course, things will happen along the way and there can be plot twists and things like that, and I appreciate all of those. But this book felt a little bit directionless. I felt like things were just kind of happening randomly. We didn't really have an end goal. And so I think this is my least favorite out of the three, especially because I really like the political intrigue in the first book, and I really like the characters and like the kind of development of the final character arcs in the last book. And so all in all, I think I would give this book probably like 3.5 out of 5 stars because I did end up enjoying it, but I didn't love it, so I don't think it deserved like a lot of stars. So the next book then I obviously read was Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, which is the third and final book in the Folk of the Air series. And this book I had a lot of fun with just because I felt like the characters really came to fruition. Like, we got the final of the character arcs, and generally I feel like the last book in a series is always fun because you get to kind of see the events, the culmination of the entire series, and you get all these fun kind of things that maybe started in the first book but you don't really get to see finish up until the last book. And it's just often it's very satisfying, and for me I felt like at this point the characters were really well developed, and at this point I really cared for the characters, whereas in the first book I didn't really care for the characters that much. So in that case I really enjoyed this book. The romance was just what made the book for me. I didn't really care about the plot, to be honest. I was kind of just waiting for the romance, and the romance killed it. I would only give this book 4 out of 5 stars. I don't think it was perfect because, again, like, I didn't love the plot of the book, but I felt like in general this book was really satisfying and it made a good conclusion to the series. And in general I really liked this series, but I have to say, I read it at the beginning of the month and now it's the end of the month, and I'm not super attached to the characters, so I don't think the series was super memorable, but it was definitely a lot of fun to read. Also, just by the way, in case you're wondering, I do have a Folk of the Air series review coming up. I think it'll be posted in 2 weeks or something like that, so stay tuned for that if you want to hear my thoughts. I do have some spoilers, although not a lot, and I just talk about the series more in depth if you're just interested in that series specifically. So the next book that I read this month was The Most Fun We Ever Had by Claire Lombardo, and this kind of comes with a backstory. So I ended up picking this book up at the beginning of the year when I was kind of interested in delving into the world of adult contemporary fiction. I got that and Recipe for a Perfect Wife by Karma Brown. And I do have a video that I posted a little while ago, my thoughts on adult contemporary fiction, I believe it's called. And I talk about kind of both of these books, and then I talk about this one specifically, and I talk about it a little bit in depth and spoiler if you wanted to know, but I will talk about it obviously here. So basically the premise of the story is it follows this family, and it's the mom and the dad, Marilyn and David, and they have 4 daughters who are now grown up, and it flashes back between kind of the beginning of the family all the way back to when Marilyn and David first met, all the way until the present. And then, so the main story is that one of the daughters had a son, and she gave him up for adoption when she was quite young, I believe in her either late teens or early 20s, and she gives him up for adoption, and then he kind of ends up re-entering everyone's life. And so that obviously throws a wrench in everyone's plans, and it changes up the dynamics of all the characters, and it's just kind of a story about family and their lives. And it was interesting, I have to say. When I first picked it up back in March, I really didn't enjoy it, and it ended up being my backup book. I have a system where I always have kind of a book on the back burner that I take a really long time to read, and I really didn't enjoy it at first. But then I ended up kind of picking it up more, and I ended up really enjoying it, so it became kind of my main book, and I ended up finishing it like halfway through. It became really interesting in my opinion. I'll go into it more in the video that I talked about, but I do generally find that the adult contemporary fiction that I've read at least tends to be kind of depressing, and it has this theme about like the inevitable decay of marriage that I really don't appreciate or love. I also really hated one of the main characters in this book, which is the oldest daughter, Wendy. I just thought she was super selfish and self-centered, and she had a lot of tragic things happen to her, but I don't think that's an excuse to be a horrible person, at least in my opinion. And I know someone who actually had been through a similar situation as her, and she ended up turning out really bubbly and positive, and she kind of worked her way through the grief, and she ended up kind of turning everything around, and she ended up having like a really happy life. What I'm trying to say, sorry if you can hear some rustling, my cats are on the floor, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't feel like her tragedy in her life was an excuse for being a horrible person, and I did feel like she was a horrible person to her sisters and basically everyone in her life. She's very inconsistent and rude, and I just really didn't like her. So it's interesting because, like I said, I didn't really like this book in the beginning, but I ended up kind of liking it in the end. But the overall tone of the book is not exactly really happy. In some ways, I feel like a lot of it is very sad and depressing, and it's a very kind of real life outlook, and it's trying to be very realistic, and it definitely is, but I don't feel like everyone in life is miserable, and I just felt like the consistent theme of these characters is that they were all unhappy, and I didn't really like that aspect of the story. So I think ultimately I would give it probably a 3 out of 5 stars, because in the end I ended up enjoying it, but I didn't like the overall theme, so I would just say this is kind of an average read. And while I do think it would be interesting if any of you guys would read it, I wouldn't necessarily highly recommend, although if you do read it or if you have read it, you know, message me or something like that, because I would like to discuss it, because it's just kind of an interesting book. Okay, so the next book that I read this month was Nyxia, which is a fun sci-fi book about kids who are sent to this alien planet to mine this stuff called Nyxia, and they're sent by this company called Babel, who kind of has evil intentions, and so it's kind of a story about the kids who go to the planet and they have to mine stuff. This first book centers around kind of who gets to go to the planet. There's like a competition on the spaceship to decide who actually gets to go to the planet, and they're getting paid a lot, so everybody really wants to win, so it's a very intense competition, and it's really fun. At first, I didn't really like the book. In the very beginning, I felt like the author was trying really, really hard to make sure that he was racially inclusive, and while I think diversity is obviously a very hugely important aspect of any book, and I really appreciate diversity, just the way he went about it was just kind of awkward and weird. He kind of forced diversity, and I did feel like it was odd because there was a specific part of the book where the characters were introducing themselves to each other, and that was a good opportunity for them to say, oh, I'm from this country, and I'm from this country, and blah blah blah, and I thought that was the perfect time for him to kind of make sure that the audience realizes that this is a very diverse cast, and he did take that chance. But what he did before they even met is he just kind of made these really awkward observations about the characters to indicate that they were diverse, and I just felt like it was a really awkward and forced moment of diversity, and I didn't really like it. I felt very much like he was kind of throwing it in our faces to be like, yes, I'm diverse, and I actually mixed this up. So I did already post the Folk of the Air review a couple weeks ago, actually, maybe 2 weeks ago. It was this review that is coming in a couple weeks, so I do apologize for that. I already reviewed the Folk of the Air, but I haven't yet posted the video of Nyxia, but it is scheduled and it is coming, and I go a little bit more in depth about that, and I did get kind of passionate about like that first stuff, and there's some other problems that I had with the beginning of the book, but at the kind of climax of the book, I got really excited and interested in it. So I did end up really enjoying the book. I think I would probably give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars just because I didn't love it. It did get me excited, but I also had some qualms about it, especially in the beginning, that I didn't really love. Then, of course, I read Nyxia Unleashed, which is the second book in the series, and again, chronicles that same journey. I had a lot of fun with this one, although I did kind of predict some part of the plot twist that came. I didn't see all of it coming, but I saw a significant portion of it. And then what kind of vibes this gave me was, reminded me of kind of reading Percy Jackson in middle school, kind of like the excitement of reading it, and not that it is anything like Percy Jackson necessarily, but the idea that it follows kind of a younger audience, because these kids, a lot of them are like 14, 15, and then eventually one does turn 16, but they're a little bit younger than a typical YA book, and I do feel like maybe they're written for middle schoolers. I don't know if I guess I didn't really talk about it, which I should say, but I was recommended this series by my brother, and I actually do kind of want to highlight it because I don't think it's ever talked about. I've never seen it talked about on BookTube or anywhere, so I do feel like this was a really fun, great sci-fi series that more people should probably read and more people would probably enjoy. I just haven't seen a lot of talk about it, so I would recommend this series. But like I was saying, I was recommended this book to me by my 12-year-old brother, and so obviously I didn't expect a lot from it, but I ended up reading the entire series and ended up really enjoying it. And so similar to kind of Percy Jackson, I feel like maybe it was written for a younger audience, like middle school, like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, but it's enjoyable by all ages. Like, I made my parents read Percy Jackson and they enjoyed it, even though it's kind of for a younger audience. I think it's still a fun book. And I feel like this one is kind of in between middle grade and YA. Like, I wouldn't say it's like a middle school book, but that's why I feel like it gives me Percy Jackson vibes, because it does have like a bigger theme and a bigger story, and it's more complex than kind of the average typical middle school book, but it's still kind of written for a younger audience, if that makes sense. Oh, and I would probably give that book a 3.5 out of 5 stars as well. Then finally I read Nyxia Uprising, which is the third and final book in the series. I apologize, I don't know where the dust jacket is, and so it doesn't really match the other books in the series, but if you decide to get the series, I recommend getting the matching covers because I just think that's more satisfying. But I thought this was a really fun and epic conclusion. I read it pretty quickly. It is obviously like a short book, but I read it pretty quickly, and I just feel like the ending was really epic, and it was just so much fun to go through with the characters. Again, I just get kind of these Percy Jackson vibes, and so I would definitely recommend this series to anyone that's interested in just like a fun sci-fi series that I do feel like it grows on you and the character bonds become really strong, and it makes you just want like a fun space family. I would give this one 4 out of 5 stars because I really enjoyed the conclusion. Next up, I finished an audiobook, which was After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I kind of have a lot of mixed thoughts on this book. When I started it, I originally picked it up because I read Taylor Jenkins Reid's other books, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six, which I both really, really enjoyed. This one definitely was not of the same caliber. It was much worse, and ultimately I would give it a 2.5 out of 5 stars just because I know what she's capable of. But let me jump into like my reasons. And first of all, if you want to know what it's about, it's basically about this couple, and they've been married for 10 years, and they decide they've fallen out of love, and so they decide to separate for 1 year and act as if they're single, and then kind of see if that works in getting them back together. And because ultimately they want to stay together, but they just don't love each other at this moment in time, and so they're hoping that some separation will be good for them. So I, again, like with a lot of the other adult contemporary fictions that I've been reading, it's just kind of a depressing outlook on marriage. It did have a happier ending. The inevitable deterioration of marriage is just such a consistent theme amongst these adult fiction books, and I don't really like that because I just feel like you read so many books for escapism, and who wants to read about the deterioration of a marriage when you want to read about like dragons and true love and stuff like that? Of course, everybody needs a reality check every once in a while. I just don't think that this was necessarily it. Also, the caliber of writing was just not that great. It was just a little bit depressing. The plot was there, but it also wasn't there. Like, there just wasn't a lot going on. I liked the themes of like family, because when the main character Lauren separates from her husband, she ends up spending a lot of time with like her family and kind of finding herself as not like a part of a marriage, but as an individual kind of person. And so I did appreciate that, but I just, in general, I just didn't love this book. And especially in the beginning, I really had to push through to finish it. And even at the end, I feel like the only reason I stuck with it was because it was on audio and because it was easy to listen to while I was doing other things. Then the next book, and then the final series that I read this month, was Renegades by Marissa Mayer, and this book is about a bunch of superheroes. It follows a villain and a hero and their kind of journey and their role as kind of, well, you know, opposites, and they're kind of fighting each other, and the villain decides to become a spy within the Renegades, which are the good guys, and they're this organization of superheroes that took over after an age of anarchy, and the age of anarchy was started by Ace Anarchy, and he wanted to rise up because the prodigies, who are the people with superpowers, were basically persecuted for a really long time. So he overthrew basically a bunch of governments, and then everything descended into a chaotic period of 20 years, and then the Renegades finally rose up and defeated him. And then now we're kind of living in a better age, but there's still a lot of deeper questions that are asked, like what makes a good society, and like who deserves to be a hero and who deserves to be a villain. And I just thought it was really interesting because not only is this just a fun read on kind of a surface level, it works kind of at a deeper level too. And I actually have a book talk coming up with my mom where we talk about her favorite book, and it's her favorite book because of those reasons. But I similarly think that Renegades kind of asks some deeper questions, maybe not as deep as my mom's favorite YA book, but I do think that it asks some deeper questions, and that it just gives you an interesting perspective on life, and it's just in general a fun read because who doesn't love superheroes? So I actually reread this book because I had read the first 2 books in the series before the third one came out. And then the third one came out, and I think it was a while ago, and I ended up purchasing it, and I had it on my shelf for a long time, but my mom's been kind of reading a lot of YA recently, so I recommended this series to her, and so she picked it up, and she read the entire series, and then she really wanted to talk about the third book with me, so I was like, oh sure, I'll read the third book. But I wanted to read the first 2 books in the series because I do feel like part of the fun of kind of reading later books in the series is rereading the first few books in the series, and then just also I did remember having a lot of fun with it. I don't really like looking up summaries because I don't feel like they give me the depth that actually reading the book would give me. So I really just wanted to reread these first 2 books before I read the third book in the series. I actually have a vlog that I'm posting right now that should be coming up. It's a little bit later than I want to, but I posted it yesterday, hopefully for you guys, and so I had some trouble, and that was me reading the third book, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. The weekend before, I was reading this book, and I ended up having a lot of trouble kind of getting through this book just because I knew what was going to happen, and it just wasn't that exciting. I feel like I can't really quantify what I would rate it because I remember having a lot of fun the first time I read it, but I didn't have as much fun the second time, and I don't think it's really necessarily fair to rate it based off the second read, just because I obviously knew what was going to happen, so all of the suspense and all of like the plot and everything just like wasn't there for me because I knew what was going to happen. And then next I read Arch Enemies by Marissa Mayer, which is the second book in the series, and again I just couldn't fall in love with this book like I did the first time around because I just simply wasn't really feeling it, and I knew everything that was going to happen. I just felt so much like, oh, this is kind of boring, but at the same time it was interesting to kind of revisit the details. I think the problem with this was just that it was so fresh in my mind that I remembered almost everything that happened, especially like the main plot points, whereas when I reread The Infernal Devices, for example, I was going into it basically fresh because I didn't remember the plot at all, so it was a lot more interesting. But I did love the romance in this one. I think the character dynamics are great, but again, this one wasn't great specifically because I felt like a lot of it was like plot and just, it wasn't a lot of like action, even though it's a superhero book and you would expect more action. It only really had like an action sequence at the beginning and the end. In the middle was a lot of kind of like dialogue and just like things moving, and of course it had to happen to get the conclusion, but it just wasn't as fun to reread. And then finally, the last book I read this month, which was I actually finished not yesterday for you guys, but on the last day of May, on May 31st, which is also my friend's birthday, Supernova by Marissa Mayer, and I had so much fun with this book. I would have to give it 5 out of 5 stars because I was just like thrilled, and like I said, in the vlog that I posted yesterday, you'll see a lot of my reactions, especially at the end. It was just so thrilling and exciting. I forgot how much I loved the series when I was reading the first 2 books because I was like, oh, these aren't that great, but then when everything was new and fresh and I didn't know what was going to happen next, it was just super exciting. And not only are the character dynamics great, but it's just, it asked the deeper questions. There was a lot more action in this book that I really appreciated, although there was some non-action. But it was just so exciting, and then the ending had a major reveal that was just insane, and it blew my mind. And I was just kind of on the edge of my seat for this one, and I really finished it in only a couple of sittings, which you know that's a good book when you just sit down and you can't get back up. Like, you just keep reading until you're really honestly forced to do something else. So that was kind of my thoughts on this book, and I just had so much fun with it. And again, you can see my reaction in the vlog that I did, but it was just insane. That is my May wrap up. I'm really pleased with the amount of books I read. I'll try to aim for another 10 this month, but we'll see if it can actually happen because I am notorious at setting myself goals and then not really necessarily achieving them. So small goals, not with like big goals. That sounded kind of self-deprecating, but I didn't mean it like that. Anyways, I had so much fun. I hope you guys will comment down below and let me know what books you read this month, or if you like any of the books that I read, or just anything like that. I would love to hear from you guys. Anyways, I'll see you later. Thank you so much for watching, and bye!